Nadia Hayes boarded that Paris flight wearing a yellow suit jacket stained with her own blood, carrying 8 months of secretly saved euros and absolutely no plan beyond survive the next 3 days. The mafia boss in the seat beside her saw the bruises, saw the terror, saw the way she flinched at every announcement, and made a decision that would either save her life or end it. What she didn't see was her husband's Range Rover pulling up to Heathrow arrivals exactly 17 minutes after their wheels touched down. She escaped her toxic marriage and boarded a plane, unaware the man beside her was a mafia boss. It had been 8 months, 8 months since Nadia Hayes first planned to leave her toxic marriage. But the thought of surviving weighed her down, leaving her to endure the pain and the beatings, the silence and the shame. The grandfather clock in the hallway of the Bordeaux estate had a cruel way of ticking, like it was keeping score of every second Nadia survived. In 8 months, she had learned the rhythms of her husband's rage the way astronomers learn the patterns of dying stars. The crunch of gravel that meant his Mercedes had returned early. The scrape of shoes on Italian marble that told her whether wine had already lit the fuse. The false tenderness in his voice when he called her mon amour before the storm broke loose. 8 months of slipping euros into the lining of a vintage handbag her grandmother had given her before she died. 8 months of counting, recounting, and recounting again like rosary beads worn smooth by desperate fingers. 8 months of keeping her smile stitched together by thread so thin a whisper could snap it. Nadia had been a scholarship student at the Sorbonne who learned early that the world didn't slow down for black girls from Detroit who spoke French with an American accent. Then he found her, Christophe Delacroix, the real estate magnate with properties spanning 3 continents and a smile that could charm diplomats and dictators alike. The man who could turn any room into a cathedral of attention. He'd seen her at a gallery opening in the Marais where she was working as a translator, her hands trembling from exhaustion and the weight of student debt pressing on her shoulders like a physical thing. He smiled at her like she was art worth collecting. He told her he would make sure she never had to count coins again, never had to choose between textbooks and dinner, never had to feel small in rooms full of people who looked through her like glass. He paid off her loans, moved her into his 17th century chateau on the outskirts of Bordeaux, and wrapped her loneliness in Hermès silk and Cartier gold. People called it a modern fairy tale. The struggling black American student and the French real estate heir. They weren't there for the after. Fairy tales have chateaus. Chateaus have cellars that lock from the outside. The night before the escape began with the sound of crystal shattering against 18th century wallpaper and ended with Nadia on the bathroom floor of the master suite, breath shallow, skin burning where his university ring had caught her cheekbone. She used to try to reason with him. She used to apologize for his anger as if it had been her clumsiness that made him lose that property deal in Monaco. Her fault that his father's cancer had returned. Her mistake that the business magazines had called him fading aristocracy clinging to old money. The last few months, she had learned a new method. Silence. Silence survived. Silence stored energy for a future that might still exist, even if that future was just 24 hours away. She sat against the clawfoot bathtub, fingers pressed to the small welt blooming near her hairline, and whispered to the imported Italian fixtures like they were witnesses who might one day testify. Tomorrow. The word felt like treason in her mouth. She had counted every euro. Tips quietly pocketed from the housekeeper who pitied her. Small refunds from returning designer clothes she pretended gave her an allergic reaction. €100 bill she found wedged behind an antique armoire, like a message from God himself. Her nest egg wasn't a fortune. It was hope measured in crumpled bills that smelled like survival and tasted like fear. At 3:47 a.m., while the chateau rested in the thick, expensive quiet that only centuries-old stone and family wealth can buy, she slid out of the king-size bed and moved through the dark like a thought she didn't want to scare away. In the walk-in closet that was larger than her childhood bedroom, she did not reach for the diamond necklace he'd given her last Christmas, or the Louis Vuitton luggage set, monogrammed with her married initials. She pulled her grandmother's battered leather handbag from the top shelf, its lining stitched with her secret currency, and a small canvas backpack containing a yellow suit jacket, a white-collared shirt, a water bottle, toiletries, and a passport she'd hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. Her heartbeat lived in her throat, in her wrists, behind her eyes. Downstairs, she passed the Steinway grand piano where she had been instructed to sit during dinner parties like a trophy that proved his worldliness and modern sensibilities. The keys stared back at her like teeth that had never smiled. The front door's lock, a supposedly antique mechanism that cost more than most people's cars, clicked open as gently as she could make it. For a moment, she waited, every sense straining for the sound of footsteps, for the alarm of a voice that owned everything it surveyed, including her. Nothing. The French countryside only breathed its pre-dawn mist. Outside, the driver usually assigned to Madame Delacroix was snoring in the renovated servant quarters that Christophe always mentioned when people implied he was old-fashioned. She didn't dare wake him. She walked, shoulders hunched against the autumn cold, slipped past the electronic gates just as dawn began sketching a thin, gray line over the vineyards, called a rideshare with a phone bought secondhand from a tourist, paid in cash, and told the driver the first lie a survivor learns to master. I'm visiting my sister in Paris. The driver, a tired-looking Algerian man who'd probably seen enough drama in his rearview mirror to write a book, nodded like people do when money changes hands and stories aren't their business. Charles de Gaulle. Airport was a city of its own. Rolling suitcases, the bitter smell of burned coffee, bored children speaking 6 different languages, and adults pretending they weren't all running from something or towards something they couldn't name. Nadia moved through it with practiced invisibility. Shoulders rounded, gaze low, steps steady but not hurried. The walk of a woman who had learned to make herself small enough to slip through the cracks. She bought a ticket with cash, her maiden name still valid on her American passport, and a flight that left before the sun could fully climb over the horizon. Gate C-29. She sat with her back to the wall like the chair might catch her if she fell apart. The yellow suit jacket she'd changed into in the airport bathroom was wrinkled. The white-collared shirt underneath still bore faint rust-colored stains she'd tried desperately to scrub out in the sink. Blood from 2 nights ago when she'd made the mistake of suggesting they cancel a dinner party because she wasn't feeling well. When they called boarding, fear hit her in a single animal wave. What if he woke early and checked the security cameras? What if he'd put a tracker in her phone she didn't know about? What if money and rage could turn all exit signs into dead ends? She felt the urge to run, except there was nowhere to run to except forward. She stood. The scanner beeped green. The jet bridge breathed recycled air on her face that smelled like 1,000 other people's escapes and returns. She stepped onto the plane. Row 23, Seat A, window. She pressed her forehead to the plastic oval and let herself look as small as she felt as the aisle filled with the little tragedies of overhead bins and elbow wars and people who had never had to count the seconds until wheels left the ground. A man slid into 23B with the quiet confidence of someone who never doubts there will be space for him in any room he enters. The mafia boss carried himself like gravity had a personal contract with his shoes. Tailored black suit that probably cost more than her entire hidden savings. Black collared shirt opened just enough to reveal a gold necklace that caught the cabin light. Not flashy, but deliberate. The kind of jewelry that suggested both wealth and warning. His skin was the pale kind that suggested Northern Europe, maybe Scandinavia, maybe Russia. His hair was dark, impeccably cut with just enough length to suggest he didn't follow trends. He set them. He smelled faintly of tobacco and winter. The mafia boss didn't look at her at first. He looked at the aisle, then at his phone, which he turned off with a deliberation that suggested discipline rather than compliance. Then at nothing, like someone accustomed to making plans inside his own head while the world waited for permission to continue. The plane shoved itself away from the gate with that particular violence that always feels both routine and miraculous. The runway stretched like a dare, like a promise, like the last chance to change your mind before you can't anymore. When the wheels lifted, Nadia's breath caught in her chest and then, unexpectedly, loosened. The ground didn't own her, not anymore, not Christoph's ground, not his country, not his rules. It was turbulence that made the mafia boss notice her. A sudden drop 30 minutes into the flight, the kind that made passengers clutch at armrests and flight attendants glance at each other like weather forecasters on live television who've just seen something on the radar they don't want to explain. Nadia flinched hard, her whole body jerking with the plane's shudder, and the movement pulled the collar of her yellow jacket sideways, exposing a constellation of fading bruises across her dark shoulder. Yellow blooming into green, green into a sickly purple-brown that told a story in the language of violence. The mafia boss turned his head because of the jolt and then didn't turn it back. His eyes were the kind that forgot how to lie somewhere in childhood and never relearned. Sharp as a knife blade, the color of smoke but heavy with thought. He didn't stare like the curious, the judgmental, or the hungry. He stared like a man memorizing a problem he intended to solve with the precision of an architect or a surgeon or something more dangerous than both. "Are you okay?" The question was low, careful, delivered in English with just the faintest trace of an accent she couldn't quite place. Eastern European, maybe, softened by years of everywhere. Nadia's mouth tried to form a practiced answer, the one she'd given doctors and hairdressers and the housekeeper who asked too many questions. I'm fine, thank you." The words felt absurd even as they came out, hollow and mechanical as a recorded message. The mafia boss reached for the call button and then stopped, reconsidering. "Headaches get worse during flights," he said, not accusing, not probing, just offering a fact like an umbrella during unexpected rain. "The cabin pressure. If you want, you can rest." He tilted his shoulder slightly toward her, an invitation without a hint of presumption or demand. No one had offered her a shoulder that wasn't going to demand interest and repayment in years. She hesitated, dignity wrestling with the exhaustion that lived in her bones now, with the need to survive the next 6 hours in a pressurized tube of strangers without falling completely apart. The mafia boss didn't push. He simply shifted, resting his forearm lightly on the armrest between them, making himself into a wall she could lean on if she chose, while also somehow making it clear that choosing not to lean would cause no offense. She chose to lean. Her head found the line between his chest and shoulder, a place that felt absurdly like a promise someone had made a long time ago and somehow kept. The scent of tobacco and winter calmed her faster than the white noise of the engines. She closed her eyes and counted. 1 breath, 2, 10, 20. Somewhere around 50, her mind finally drifted to that strange land between sleep and vigilance, where alarms still ring but sound very far away, like church bells in another village. The mafia boss didn't move for the next hour. He didn't speak. He adjusted his posture twice, small, careful movements so her neck wouldn't cramp. And with his free hand, barely perceptible to anyone who wasn't paying attention, he tugged the overhead air nozzle to direct a gentle stream of air so she wouldn't overheat against his body warmth. The gesture was instinctive, thoughtless, the kind that reveals a person's truest language before their mouth can translate it into something more acceptable. When the seatbelt sign dinged off an hour later, a flight attendant started down the aisle with the powdered smile of professional service, already preparing to offer drinks in that particular sing-song voice they all seemed to learn in training. The mafia boss raised a single finger. Not now. The smile on the flight attendant's face softened into something real, something almost relieved. She moved on without a word. Another hour passed. Nadia stirred, disoriented by the intimacy of peace, by the fact that her body had relaxed enough to actually sleep. Memory flooded back like cold water. The chateau, the bruises, the plan, the takeoff, the stranger. She sat up quickly, cheeks warming with embarrassment. "I'm sorry," she said, eyes avoiding his, focusing instead on the seat pocket in front of her. "No apology necessary." His voice had the faintest slice of an accent she could now place better. Czech, maybe, or Polish. Softened by years of everywhere and nowhere. "I'm Casper." She almost didn't offer her name. Names are keys. Keys open doors. Doors can be kicked in by men with enough motivation and money. But he'd given his first. The gesture felt like a contract of equal exchange. "Nadia? Nice to meet you, Nadia." The mafia boss didn't thrust out a hand for a shake or try to make a joke to cut the tension. He just gave her the respect of ordinary conversation, the kind you forget how to have when your house is a stage for someone else's moods and your words are auditioned before you're allowed to speak them. The flight attendant reappeared with the drink cart, moving with that particular efficiency of people who do the same task 200 times a week. "Something to drink?" "Water," Nadia said, her voice still rough with sleep. "Same," the mafia boss added, then nodded at a small pin on the attendant's uniform, an enamel flag she probably thought nobody noticed. "Romania?" She blinked, surprised by the observation. "Yes, Bucharest originally." "Beautiful city. The Athenaeum Concert Hall is one of the most underrated venues in Europe." Her professional smile transformed into something genuine. You've been? Several times. The acoustics are remarkable. The Mafia boss paused, then added, Thank you for your service today. Long flights are made bearable by people who notice the small things. She poured 2 cups of water, set them down with a little more care than regulation requires, and disappeared down the aisle with a smile that wasn't manufactured at all. The Mafia boss waited until they were alone again, until the noise of the cabin had returned to its baseline hum of engines and distant conversations, and someone's child asking repeatedly about the clouds outside. If I ask a question that's none of my business, he said carefully, tell me to stop. He paused, giving her time to build whatever walls she needed. Are you traveling to someone or away from someone? The truth leaped to her throat. She swallowed it like a stone. Away. So far away he'll never find me. So far away I can forget what his hands feel like. So far away I can hear my own thoughts again. The Mafia boss nodded once, like a chess player seeing the next 3 moves on a board only he could perceive. He didn't ask why, didn't demand details, didn't offer platitudes about how it would get better, or how she was brave, or any of the things people say when they're uncomfortable with someone else's pain. Instead, do you have a safe place to land? Nadia's laugh came out thin, sharp at the edges. I have a hostel reservation in London for 3 nights. After that, I have hope and a resume. The corner of the Mafia boss's mouth lifted, not in humor exactly, but in acknowledgement of a specific kind of courage that most people never have to learn. Hope and a resume are a start. Silence filled the space between them. Not the heavy kind that comes from danger or judgment, but the strange, suspended kind that shows up right before a decision that will change everything. The Mafia boss studied the seat in front of him for a beat, then spoke like he was picking up a conversation they'd already been having in some parallel version of this flight. I hate seeing bruises on women, he said, quiet steel threading through the words like rebar in concrete. And I've seen a lot, more than anyone should, in any lifetime. He didn't look at her as he said it. He looked at the aisle, and for just a moment, something ancient and heavy crossed his face. Not quite pain, but the memory of it, the scar tissue where pain used to live. If someone did that to you, the Mafia boss continued, his voice dropping even lower, I need you to know one thing. It's not your fault. Not what he did. Not what he said to make you believe it was. Not the fact that you stayed as long as you did. None of it. No one had ever said that sentence to her without a but waiting behind it like an ambush. But you should have left sooner. But you must have known what he was like. But why did you marry him? Nadia stared at the tray table latch until it blurred. Thank you. They didn't speak for a while after that. The plane hummed its mechanical lullaby. People snored in that particular way people do when they're trapped in a metal tube, and their bodies decide unconsciousness is the only escape. A child somewhere near the back asked for apple juice, like it was the most important diplomatic negotiation in human history. At 37,000 feet, life is both unbearably fragile and ridiculously ordinary, existing in the same moment, in the same pressurized air. When the captain announced the descent into London Heathrow, that particular tone of voice pilots use that suggests both routine and the minor miracle of controlled falling, Nadia's pulse began to race again. On the ground, reality would start running and would expect her to keep up. On the ground, Christoph's lawyers and money and rage would have jurisdiction again. The mafia boss noticed the way her hands tightened on the armrests, knuckles standing out against her dark skin. "I have a property near the city," he said, his tone neutral, almost clinical, as if he were discussing the weather or the stock market. "Kensington. 3 bedrooms, full security system, doorman who used to work protection details for diplomats. You could stay there for a few days while you sort out next steps. No pressure, no cost, no strings." A normal man's offer would have frightened her. Should have frightened her. Every instinct trained into women since childhood should have been screaming. But the mafia boss's offer didn't sit on him like a trap. It sat like armor he put on every day, so familiar he'd forgotten he was wearing it. Still, fear is clever. Fear has kept women alive for millennia by making them suspicious of generosity. "I don't know you," she said simply. "That's wise," the mafia boss replied without hesitation. "You shouldn't know me. You shouldn't trust me." He pulled a card from a wallet that looked both expensive and well used, leather worn soft in the corners. Matte black cardstock, no logo, just a phone number and a first name embossed in silver. "Take this. If you feel unsafe at any moment, call me or text me, or ignore it completely. Your choice. Always your choice." She hesitated, then slipped the card into the hidden lining of her grandmother's purse, the same place that had held 8 months of survival in folded euros. "Thank you." The wheels kissed the runway with that particular violence that always makes people gasp a little, no matter how many times they've flown. People clapped like they were saving the plane with their palms, like their applause was the magic spell that had kept them from falling. The cabin lights shifted to morning. Reality filtered in through the windows, gray English sky, rain on tarmac, the ordinary miracle of being alive in a different country than you woke up in. When the seatbelt sign chimed off, the mafia boss didn't jump up like the aisle runners, didn't join the standing stampede of people desperate to gain 60 seconds. He waited, letting the frantic world empty out one restless row at a time. As they stood, the mafia boss shrugged off his black suit jacket without asking and draped it over her shoulders. It was warm from his body, heavier than it looked, with something hard in the inside pocket she chose not to think about, and it covered the telltale shadows on her skin, the blood stains on her white shirt. "Just until you get through customs," the mafia boss said, as if it were the most mundane thing in the world. "Less attention." She swallowed hard. "You notice everything." "It keeps me alive." They walked off the plane together, two strangers connected by a thin thread of decency and something unnameable that felt like the moment before thunder, when the air itself holds its breath. At the end of the jet bridge, the mafia boss slowed his pace deliberately. "There will be people who think they can decide your life for you," he said, eyes finally meeting hers fully, smoke gray and absolutely certain. "Men who think your story ends where their will begins. Don't hand them the pen." The airport roared around them, a dozen languages, rubber wheels on industrial carpet, the particular desperation of people late for connections. She nodded, not trusting her voice. They reached the fork where baggage claim splits from the international arrival gates. The mafia boss gestured toward the signs with a slight tilt of his head. Which way? Baggage, she said. Just a backpack. That's it? That's everything that matters. Something shifted in the Mafia boss's expression, a flicker of respect or recognition, or perhaps memory of his own escapes. They moved in tandem through the crowd, and Nadia noticed how people parted for the Mafia boss without seeming to realize they were doing it. Not aggressively, he wasn't large or intimidating in obvious ways, but something in his presence suggested that obstacles simply move themselves rather than make him go around. Near the baggage carousel, a pair of men in expensive suits stood scanning faces with the efficient disinterest of professionals. Dark suits, darker eyes, the kind of patient stillness that suggested they were being paid by the hour and were very, very good at waiting. Something in the angle of their shoulders, the way their eyes moved in a pattern rather than randomly, tightened the Mafia boss's jaw almost imperceptibly. "Friends of yours?" he asked lightly, as if commenting on the weather. "No," Nadia breathed, panic waking up hard and fast in her chest. "Christophe uses private security like other people use credit cards. Men who don't ask questions and don't remember faces." The Mafia boss didn't touch her, didn't grab her arm or pull her close. He simply stepped slightly to the left, making his frame a shield, positioning himself between her and the men's line of sight with the casual precision of someone who'd done this before. Then, with the ease of someone checking the time, he took out his phone and snapped 3 quick photos. The men's faces, their shoes, the small insignia on the taller one's lapel that probably meant something to someone. "Interesting," the Mafia boss murmured, almost to himself, thumbs moving across his phone screen with practiced speed. The baggage carousel groaned to life. Nadia's small canvas backpack appeared almost immediately, looking pitifully small among the matched luggage sets and oversized suitcases. She grabbed it quickly, and they drifted toward the exit with the current of travelers. 2 fish in a school that made them invisible. The men didn't follow. Yet. Outside, the English air smelled like wine and car exhaust and possibility. London sprawled before them, gray and enormous and indifferent to one woman's small escape. A black Mercedes sedan pulled up with the timing of something choreographed. The driver, an older man with kind eyes, a boxer's broken nose, and hands that looked like they'd built cathedrals and also torn them down, stepped out and opened the rear door without a word. The Mafia boss opened the door wider, then paused, turning to Nadia with an expression that was no longer gentle. It was protective, and it had teeth. "Last question," he said. "Do you want help, or do you want me to mind my own business? Both answers are acceptable. Both answers are honorable." Nadia looked at the open car, at the crowd streaming past them, at the phone clutched in her hand with a hostel's address, and 3 nights of safety before the money ran out and the world expected her to have figured out how to rebuild a life from broken pieces. She thought about 8 months of counting, 8 months of learning which footsteps meant violence and which meant only contempt. The sound of crystal breaking, the feeling of marble floor against her cheek. The way "I love you" had become the most frightening phrase in any language. She thought about the way his shoulder had felt like a coastline for a ship that had been storm-tossed for so long it had forgotten what anchors were for. "I want help," she said, voice steady for the first time that day, maybe that year. "But I don't want to disappear into someone else's protection like I disappeared into someone else's control. I want my life back, my name, my choices, everything. The mafia boss nodded once, decisive, final. Then we start with three things: a doctor, a safe bed, and a plan. He gestured to the car again. She took one step forward and froze. Across the drop-off lane, weaving between taxis and shuttle buses, with the confidence of someone who expected traffic to part for him, a familiar figure had just climbed out of a black Range Rover, flanked by two more men in matching dark suits. Christophe Delacroix scanned the crowd with pale blue eyes that had once looked at her like a prize, and now searched for her like a possession that had been stolen. His gaze swept across the sea of travelers with the methodical efficiency of a searchlight looking for escapees. It landed on the space where she had been standing exactly 2 seconds earlier, because the mafia boss had already moved. He slid in front of her, calm as a held breath, his voice suddenly knife-sharp as he spoke to his driver without looking away from the threat. "Victor, now!" The sedan's door was already open. The mafia boss's hand hovered inches from Nadia's elbow, not touching, not forcing, just guiding like a current in a river that knew exactly where it was going. "Get in," the mafia boss said softly, but with absolute authority. "You're safe." She believed him, even as her heart thundered, even as her hands shook, even as every instinct screamed that men who give orders are men who take control. She believed him. She ducked into the back seat. The mafia boss followed, closing the door with a deliberate click that sounded like a vault closing, like a promise being sealed, like the final word in a conversation that had lasted 8 months too long. The car shot forward into airport traffic, a black needle threading through a fabric of brake lights and impatient horns and ordinary people living ordinary lives where husbands didn't hunt their wives through international terminals. Nadia looked back through the tinted glass, watching the airport recede. Christophe had turned toward the commotion of the departing Mercedes, jaw set, eyes wide with the disbelief of a man who has never been told no, who has never lost anything he decided to keep. Their gazes didn't meet. Not this time. In the shadowed quiet of the sedan, rain beginning to speckle the windows as Victor navigated toward the motorway, the mafia boss finally asked the question he'd earned the right to ask. "Nadia," he said, eyes steady on hers in the dim light, smoke-gray irises reflecting the passing streetlights like stars in a winter sky. "Who put those bruises on you?" The car raced through London like it was running from the past, which, in a sense, it was. Nadia sat in the back seat of the Mercedes, trembling despite the warmth, her fingers gripping the edge of the mafia boss's jacket that still draped over her shoulders. The hum of expensive tires on wet asphalt mixed with the pounding of her heart in a rhythm that sounded like escape, escape, escape. Every traffic light felt like a trap. Every honk sounded like Christophe's voice. Every dark SUV in the adjacent lane looked like it might be carrying men paid to drag her back to the chateau, and the life that was killing her degree by degree. She had imagined escape 1,000 times during those 8 months, in the shower, in bed while he slept, in the garden while pretending to admire roses she'd stopped seeing as beautiful. But never like this. Never with a stranger who looked like power had been tailored into a suit and worn until it became a second skin. The mafia boss leaned slightly forward, his eyes on the rearview mirror with the focused attention of a man who'd learned long ago that survival lives in details. His voice was calm, but it carried the kind of authority that could silence storms or start them, depending on what the moment required. "Victor," he said quietly in English, though something in his tone suggested he was translating from another language in his mind, "don't go straight to Kensington. Take the long route, through Camden, then double back through Islington." "We're not being followed, boss," Victor replied in an accent that confirmed Nadia's earlier guess. Eastern European, probably Czech, definitely a man who'd seen enough to know the difference between caution and paranoia. "But I don't like coincidences either." "Neither do I." The word boss hit Nadia's ears and lodged there like a splinter. It wasn't the kind of title people used for regular businessmen, even wealthy ones. Not Sir or Mr. Casper, but boss, in the way that suggested structure, hierarchy, the kind of organization that operated by different rules than the ones printed in law books. She turned to look at the Mafia boss, really look at him for the first time since they'd met. The sharp jawline, the calm eyes that seemed to see 3 moves ahead in every situation. The gold necklace just visible against his black shirt. Not a chain, she realized now, but something that looked old, possibly religious, definitely meaningful. The faint scar along his left temple that she'd missed before, the kind that comes from something sharp wielded with intent. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you really?" The Mafia boss turned to her, and for a moment, something flickered across his face. Not quite vulnerability, but perhaps the memory of a time when he'd been vulnerable before whatever had happened to make him into this. "Someone who doesn't tolerate men who hurt women," he said simply. "That's all you need to know for now." That's not an answer. It's the only answer that matters at the moment. The car weaved through traffic with practiced efficiency, Victor navigating London's arteries like a surgeon working on a patient he'd operated on 100 times before. Neon lights from shops and restaurants flashed across the Mafia boss's face in intervals. Gold, red, blue, white, painting him in colors that made him look almost unreal, like a figure from a story rather than a man made of flesh and decisions. Nadia studied him, her mind trying to reconcile the gentle way he'd offered his shoulder on the plane with the steel in his voice now, the way Victor called him boss, the fact that he carried himself like someone who'd given orders that changed people's lives and had made peace with that power. "You're not just a businessman, are you?" she said quietly. The Mafia boss smiled faintly, and it was the saddest smile she'd ever seen on a face that young. He couldn't have been more than 35. "No, I'm not just a businessman." "Then what are you?" "Careful," the Mafia boss said, but there was no threat in it, only a warning given by someone who genuinely wanted her to understand the weight of knowledge. "Some questions have answers that can't be unlearned." They pulled into an underground parking garage beneath a building that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed architecture should be both art and fortress. Glass and steel and security cameras that blinked red eyes in every corner like electronic guardians. A guard at the entrance straightened visibly as their car approached, pressing a button that raised the barrier before Victor had even slowed down. The guard placed his hand over his heart in a gesture that looked almost medieval in its formality. "Welcome back, Mr. Casper." The guard's voice crackled through Victor's lowered window. The Mafia boss nodded acknowledgement. Nothing more. As the elevator doors closed behind them, Victor remaining with the car. Silence thickened the air between Nadia and the Mafia boss like humidity before a storm. The mirrored walls reflected her bruised face beside his composed one, a haunting contrast between brokenness trying to heal and control that had been mastered so long ago it looked like nature. The yellow suit jacket hung wrinkled on her frame. The white shirt underneath still bore those rust-colored stains she'd scrubbed at in the airport bathroom, smaller now but still visible if you knew to look. Her hair, natural and pulled back in a hasty bun, had come partially loose during the flight, giving her a disheveled appearance that she would have been embarrassed by 24 hours ago. Now she was just grateful to be alive and moving forward instead of in circles. The elevator climbed silently, the numbers ticking up with European efficiency: 3, 5, 7, 9. When it finally stopped at 12, the doors opened onto a private vestibule with only one door, reinforced steel disguised as elegant wood, with a biometric scanner where a doorknob should be. The Mafia boss pressed his thumb to the scanner. Something clicked with the sound of expensive German engineering. The door opened onto a penthouse that could have been featured in magazines about how the other 0.5% lived. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed London's skyline, rain streaking down the glass like slow tears the city was crying for all its lost souls. Every corner whispered luxury in a language Nadia had learned to read during her marriage. Black Italian marble floors, furniture that looked like it cost more than most people's annual salaries, abstract art on the walls that was either brilliant or pretentious depending on who was looking, and shelves of books that actually appeared to have been read, their spines creased with attention. "This is temporary," the Mafia boss said, walking ahead with the easy familiarity of someone who'd crossed this threshold 1,000 times. "Until you figure out what you want to do next." I Nadia's voice caught. "I can't stay here. He'll find me. Christoph has connections everywhere, money everywhere, people who owe him favors in every major city. He always finds what belongs to him." She heard the words as she said them and hated how they sounded. Belongs to him. As if she were a thing, property, a possession that had wandered off. The Mafia boss turned, and for the first time since they'd met, she saw something that might have been anger flicker across his face. Not at her, for her. "You don't belong to him," he said, each word measured and deliberate. "You never did. Marriage is not ownership, no matter what he told you. No matter what he made you believe when he was breaking you down piece by piece until you couldn't remember who you were before him." The accuracy of his words hit her like cold water. "Not here," the Mafia boss continued, his voice softer now but no less certain. "No one gets into this building without my permission. No one reaches this floor without codes that change daily. No one touches you without going through me first. And I promise you, Nadia, that is not a door anyone wants to try to open." Something in the way he said it, not as a threat but as a simple statement of fact. The way you might say rain is wet or fire burns, made her believe him. She looked around the penthouse again, seeing it differently now. Not just luxury, security. The cameras were subtle but present. The windows were likely bulletproof. The door she'd walked through probably had locks that could withstand a small army. "What are you?" she asked again, quieter this time. "Someone who knows what it's like to lose people because you weren't strong enough, weren't prepared enough, weren't ruthless enough when ruthlessness was required." The mafia boss walked to the window, hands in his pockets, silhouetted against London's electric glow. "I won't make that mistake again." Before she could ask what he meant, his phone buzzed. The mafia boss glanced at it, frowned, typed something quickly, then looked back at her. "A doctor will be here in 20 minutes, he said. "She's discreet, experienced, and she's seen worse than what you're carrying." "You called a doctor without asking me?" "Yes." No apology in the mafia boss's tone. "You need medical attention. I'm providing it. When she leaves, you can decide if you want to stay or go. But the doctor comes first." Nadia wanted to be angry at his presumption, at the way he'd made decisions about her body, her health, her choices. But under the anger was something else. Relief. The exhausting relief of not having to be the only one making decisions for the first time in 8 months. She nodded, suddenly too tired to argue. The doctor arrived exactly 20 minutes later, announced by a soft chime from the mafia boss's phone. She was an older woman, Indian perhaps, with silver streaking through black hair pulled back in a neat bun, and eyes that knew too many secrets but had learned when to keep them. She carried a medical bag that looked well-traveled and introduced herself simply as Dr. Mehta. She examined Nadia quietly in one of the guest bedrooms while the mafia boss stood near the window in the main room, back turned, giving privacy but not distance. The placement was deliberate, close enough to protect, far enough to respect boundaries. "You're dehydrated," Dr. Mehta said softly when she'd finished, her accent British with roots somewhere else. "And you have bruising consistent with repeated physical assault over an extended period. The pattern suggests someone who knows how to hurt without leaving marks that show in clothing. Professional, in a terrible sense." She cleaned and bandaged a small cut near Nadia's hairline that had reopened during the flight. "You also have 2 cracked ribs that are healing incorrectly. They should have been wrapped weeks ago. And you're malnourished, not starvation, but the kind of controlled deprivation that happens when someone uses food as another tool of control." Nadia's eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. "You need rest, safety, proper nutrition, and eventually therapy," Dr. Mehta continued, packing her instruments with practiced efficiency. "The body heals faster than the mind in these situations. Be patient with yourself." When they returned to the main room, the mafia boss was on the phone speaking rapid Czech. Nadia was sure of the language now. He ended the call as they entered. "Everything you need for her," the mafia boss said to Dr. Mehta, not asking, not suggesting. "Medication, vitamins, whatever protocols you recommend, have it delivered here by morning." He paused. "And double your usual fee." Dr. Mehta nodded, no surprise on her face at either the request or the compensation. "She'll need follow-up in a week. I'll schedule it." As the doctor packed her kit and prepared to leave, Nadia stood by those massive windows, staring at the city lights that stretched to the horizon. Down below, cars moved like blood through veins. People lived lives that didn't include running from chateaus or sleeping on strangers' planes, or wondering if your husband was currently on another flight planning how to make you disappear. After Dr. Mehta left with the same quiet efficiency she'd arrived with, the Mafia boss approached slowly, his footsteps nearly silent on the marble floor. "You can take the guest room," he said, gesturing toward a hallway that led deeper into the penthouse. "End of the hall on the left. Fresh clothes are in the closet. I had Victor arrange it while we were in transit. They should fit approximately, and if they don't, we'll fix it tomorrow." "You had clothes bought for me?" Nadia turned to face him. "When? How?" "I called Victor from the plane while you were sleeping," the Mafia boss said simply, "gave him your approximate size, and told him to prioritize comfort over fashion." "You were that sure I'd come here? That confident?" "No." His eyes met hers. "I was that hopeful. There's a difference." She stared at the Mafia boss, trying to figure out if she was more grateful or terrified, or some combination of both that didn't have a name yet. "If you're hungry," the Mafia boss continued, "the kitchen is stocked. If you need anything else, I'll be awake. I don't sleep much." "Thank you," she murmured, the words feeling inadequate for what he'd done in the span of 6 hours. "For everything." The Mafia boss gave a small nod, then hesitated, as if deciding whether to say something else. "You don't have to thank me, Nadia. What happened to you shouldn't have happened to anyone. This—" He gestured vaguely at the penthouse, at the security, at the help he'd provided. "This is just restoring a small piece of the balance the universe got wrong." As the Mafia boss turned to leave, she called out, "Casper." He paused. "You still haven't told me what you really do. Who you really are." The Mafia boss was quiet for a long moment, his back still to her, shoulders tense in a way that suggested the question cost him something to hear. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost tired. "I'm someone who deals with problems that the law can't or won't solve. I run an organization that operates in the spaces between what's legal and what's necessary. I protect people who need protection, and I make threats disappear when threats refuse to take no for an answer." He turned partially, enough that she could see his profile. "I'm what people call a mafia boss, though I hate that term. It makes it sound romantic, like something from films. It's not. It's just business conducted by different rules for different purposes." The word hung in the air between them like smoke. Mafia boss. Nadia's heartbeat jumped, and every warning she'd ever heard about men like him flashed through her head in rapid succession. Dangerous, criminal, violent, men who solved problems with money and threats and worse. But instead of fear, she felt something unexpected. Something like vindication, because the same world that had told her to be afraid of men like the Mafia boss had also told her that men like Christoph were pillars of society, and she knew firsthand which one was true. "Okay," she said quietly. The Mafia boss turned fully then, surprise evident on his face. "Okay. You've been nothing but kind to me. You saw me at my weakest and didn't take advantage. You offered help with escape routes built in. You made sure a doctor saw me. You're giving me choices." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly very aware that she was wearing his jacket over blood-stained clothes in a Mafia boss's penthouse, having a conversation that would have seemed impossible 8 hours ago. "I think I've learned that what someone does matters more than what they're called." Something shifted in the Mafia boss's expression, a crack in the armor, a brief glimpse of a man who maybe hadn't expected to be seen as human rather than threat. "Go to sleep, Nadia," the mafia boss said gently, his voice rough at the edges. "Tomorrow you'll decide what you want to do next. I'll make sure you have the resources to do it, whatever it is." She nodded and walked down the hallway, each step feeling both surreal and more solid than anything had felt in months. The guest room was exactly as promised, comfortable without being ostentatious, with a bed that looked like it might actually let her sleep without nightmares. On the dresser, she found clothes in her size: soft cotton shirts, comfortable pants, underwear still in packaging, even slippers. The precision of it all was almost unsettling. Either the mafia boss was remarkably observant, or he'd done this before, provided sanctuary for someone running from violence. She showered in the ensuite bathroom, watching 8 months of fear and blood and chateau marble dust swirl down the drain in water that ran from brown to pink to finally clear. When she emerged, she found a sealed bottle of water on the nightstand. She hadn't heard anyone enter. And a note in precise handwriting: "If you need anything, I'm in the room at the other end of the hall. The door stays unlocked. K." Nadia climbed into bed, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't wake to yelling or footsteps. She woke to sunlight spilling through floor-to-ceiling windows like forgiveness, like a promise that morning could be gentle again. The aroma of coffee drifted through the air, familiar and comforting in its ordinariness. She stepped into the main living area wearing one of the soft cotton shirts the mafia boss had somehow acquired, her natural hair loose around her shoulders in a way Christophe had always forbidden. He'd insisted she straighten it, or at least keep it neat, which was his code word for conforming to his aesthetic preferences rather than her own identity. The mafia boss stood by the kitchen counter in dark slacks and a gray Henley, sleeves rolled to his elbows, stirring coffee in a French press with the focused attention most people reserve for far more complicated tasks. The sight of him in the soft morning light was almost jarring. He looked less like danger and more like someone who might have been a professor or an architect in a different life, if choices had been different, if the world had been kinder, or he'd been luckier. "You slept," the mafia boss said, not asking, just observing. "I tried," Nadia replied, moving closer. "It's strange not to wake up afraid. My body kept expecting footsteps or yelling or something breaking, and when it didn't come, I almost didn't know what to do with the quiet." "That's what healing feels like at first," the mafia boss said, pouring coffee into two mugs that looked handmade, ceramic glazed in deep blue. "Strange, almost wrong. Your mind takes longer than your body to believe the threat is really gone." The mafia boss handed her a mug, and their fingers brushed in the exchange. For a second that felt much longer than it was, the world outside the windows stopped spinning. London traffic, millions of lives, centuries of history, all paused for a breath that only the two of them heard. Then his phone buzzed on the counter, shattering the moment like glass. The mafia boss glanced at the screen, and his jaw tightened in that particular way she was learning meant bad news delivered through digital text. "What is it?" Nadia asked, dread already rising in her throat. The mafia boss hesitated, then turned the phone so she could see the message. It was a news alert from a French outlet, the headline in bold. Below it, her wedding photo. Nadia in white, smiling that stitched-together smile she'd perfected. Christophe beside her, looking every bit the gentleman the world believed him to be. Nadia's blood went cold. Her hands started shaking, coffee sloshing dangerously close to the rim of her mug. "He's looking for me," she whispered, the words barely making it past her lips. "He's not just looking, he's hunting, and he's weaponizing the media to do it." The Mafia boss took the mug from her trembling hands and set both cups on the counter. When he spoke, his voice was measured, controlled, the voice of someone who dealt with threats before and knew panic only made them worse. "He's not just looking," the Mafia boss agreed. "He's using every resource he has: money, reputation, public sympathy. He'll paint himself as the worried husband and you as unstable. Probably claim you're having a mental health crisis, need medication, might hurt yourself. It's a standard play for men like him." "Then I need to run farther," Nadia said, her voice rising with panic. "London isn't far enough. I need to disappear completely, change my name, my hair, everything. He has connections in every major city in Europe, private investigators, security firms, people who owe him favors." "No." The word cut through her rising panic like a knife through fabric. "No?" She stared at the Mafia boss. "No? You don't understand what he's capable of." "I understand exactly what he's capable of," the Mafia boss interrupted, his tone still calm but with steel underneath. "Men like your husband, they have money and connections, but they operate within society's rules because their power depends on reputation. They can't actually hurt you without destroying the image they've built. And that's their weakness." The Mafia boss walked toward the window, mind already moving faster than words, the way chess players think 3 moves ahead while everyone else is still figuring out how the pieces move. "Running won't help you," the Mafia boss said, watching London wake up below them. "He'll use your fear to track you. Every new identity leaves a trail. Every border crossing gets recorded. Every hotel requires documentation. With 50,000 euros, he'll have people looking for you in every city you might run to, and eventually, someone will notice the pattern." Nadia wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the walls closing in despite being in a penthouse with views for miles. "Then what do I do?" Her voice broke on the question. "Just wait here until he finds this place too? Until his lawyers get the police involved and they knock on your door and force you to hand me over?" The Mafia boss turned from the window, and when he looked at her, his eyes held something she hadn't seen before. Not kindness exactly, resolve. "We don't run, we dismantle him, systematically, legally where possible, and through other means where necessary." The Mafia boss walked back toward her. "What we need is to make him believe you've disappeared so completely that searching becomes pointless, while simultaneously destroying the foundation his power rests on." "What does that mean?" "It means I handle this the way I handle every problem that refuses to solve itself." The Mafia boss paused, choosing his words carefully. "But first, I need your permission. Because what I'm offering isn't protection in the passive sense, hiding you away and hoping he gives up. I'm offering to end his ability to ever threaten you again. Permanently." The way the Mafia boss said permanently sent a chill down her spine that was part fear and part something else she didn't want to name. "You mean," she started, "I mean, I destroy everything he's built," the Mafia boss interrupted, knowing what she was thinking. His reputation, his business interests, his political connections, his ability to operate in polite society. I make him radioactive to anyone who values their own reputation. I don't kill him. That's messy and creates martyrs. I just make him irrelevant. Nadia stared at the mafia boss, trying to process what he was offering. A man she'd met on a plane less than 24 hours ago was proposing to go to war with one of the wealthiest men in France on her behalf. Why? She asked. Why would you do this? You don't owe me anything. We're strangers who happen to sit next to each other. The mafia boss was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried weight from somewhere deep. My sister, the mafia boss said quietly. Katya. When I was 22 and stupid and thought money and guns made you powerful, she was married to a man who hurt her. I didn't know until it was too late. I was too busy building what I thought mattered: territory, respect, fear. She tried to leave him once. He found her, brought her back. The second time she tried to leave. The mafia boss stopped, jaw working. She didn't make it to a second time. She walked into the Vltava River in Prague with stones in her pockets. Nadia's hand went to her mouth. I promised myself that day, the mafia boss continued, his voice rough with old grief that had scarred over but never fully healed, that if I ever had the power to stop it from happening to someone else, I would. No matter the cost, no matter the risk. Because wealth and power and all the things I'd built meant nothing when it mattered most. The mafia boss looked at her directly, and his eyes held years of regret transformed into purpose. You're not Katya, and I'm not 22 anymore, so this time I don't fail. Nadia felt tears slip down her cheeks, but for the first time in 8 months, they weren't tears of fear or pain. They were tears of being seen, of being valued, of someone caring enough to remember their dead and honor them by helping the living. Okay, she whispered. Okay. You're sure? The mafia boss asked. Because once I start this, it doesn't stop until it's finished. Your husband will know someone powerful is coming for him, and he'll lash out. It might get worse before it gets better. I'm sure. Nadia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I'm so tired of being afraid. I'm so tired of being his possession. If you can take that away from him, if you can make it so he never hurts another woman the way he hurt me. She took a shaking breath. Then yes. Please. Help me. The mafia boss nodded once, decisive, final, the way generals nod when battle plans are approved. The mafia boss walked to a desk in the corner, pulled out a laptop, and began typing with the speed of someone who'd done this before. Within minutes, his phone started buzzing with incoming responses. Nadia watched the mafia boss work, watched him transform from the gentleman who'd offered his shoulder on a plane into something else. A mafia boss conducting business with the efficiency of a conductor leading an orchestra toward a crescendo only he could hear. What are you doing? She asked. Calling in every favor I'm owed, the mafia boss said without looking up, and offering substantial payment for the ones I'm not. By tonight, I'll have complete files on your husband's business dealings, his associates, his secrets, his leverage points. By tomorrow morning, the first domino falls. What domino? The mafia boss looked up and his smile was sharp enough to cut. His primary lawyer just got a very lucrative job offer in Singapore, far away from France. He leaves next week. Just like that? Money talks in every language, Nadia, and I speak it fluently. Over the next 3 days, Nadia watched Christophe Delacroix's world begin to crumble with the slow, methodical precision of a demolition expert bringing down a building floor by floor. His top lawyer accepted that job in Singapore and took half his client files with him, citing ethical concerns about Christoph's business practices, concerns that had apparently been encouraged by a very generous anonymous donation to his favorite charity, and a reminder about certain tax irregularities that could become problematic if investigated. His primary private investigator was arrested in London for bribery and evidence tampering in an unrelated case, a case that somehow materialized with perfect timing and ironclad evidence delivered to authorities anonymously. A journalist, one who owed the Mafia boss a favor from years ago involving a sister who needed protection from a stalker, published an expose about Christophe's real estate dealings, specifically how he displaced low-income families from rent-controlled properties in Paris through intimidation and questionable legal maneuvers. His name, once polished and powerful, began appearing in news cycles with words like alleged and questionable and under investigation. Nadia watched it unfold from the Mafia boss's penthouse, spending her days painting for the first time since before the marriage. The Mafia boss had bought her supplies without asking, just appeared one day with canvas and oils and brushes, and her evenings watching the Mafia boss work with quiet, lethal efficiency. She often found herself painting late into the night while the Mafia boss sat on the leather couch across from her, pretending to read, but actually watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Every time she finished a piece, the Mafia boss would study it carefully and say something simple. That's healing taking shape. That's anger finding voice. That's strength remembering itself. Never flowery, never excessive, just truth delivered plainly. It wasn't love yet, it was something rarer, safety with heat underneath, like coals that glow hotter the longer they burn. One evening, she walked into the study and froze. The Mafia boss was on a call, his jaw tight, voice low and dangerous in a way she hadn't heard before. "No one touches him until I say so," the Mafia boss growled into the phone, the threat fully present in a way that sent ice down her spine. "He needs to watch everything he built collapse before he breaks. Fear works better when it's slow." Nadia swallowed hard. "You're going after him yourself." The Mafia boss ended the call with a tap and turned toward her. "He hurt you. He's still trying to hurt you. That ends tonight." Her pulse quickened. "You can't just kill him?" The Mafia boss raised an eyebrow. "I told you before, I'm not interested in murder. It's messy, creates legal problems, and makes martyrs. But I can absolutely destroy his ability to ever threaten you again." "How?" The Mafia boss slid a small flash drive across the desk toward her. "This holds bank records showing years of tax evasion, money laundering through shell companies in the Cayman Islands, and payments to officials for favorable building permits. Enough evidence to send him to prison for 15 years if properly presented to the right authorities." Nadia stared at the flash drive like it was a bomb. "But," the Mafia boss continued, his voice softening slightly, "it won't matter unless you're willing to testify, to tell your story publicly, to let the world see what he did to you in private." She felt her stomach drop. "You want me to go public?" "I need you to find your voice again," the Mafia boss said gently. because all the evidence in the world won't convict him if you're not willing to stand up and say what he did. Courts need testimony, juries need faces, justice needs courage. Nadia wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the room. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I've been silent my whole life. Every time I spoke up as a kid in foster care, I got punished. Every time I questioned Christoph, I learned that silence kept me safe. My voice has been stolen so many times, I'm not sure I know how to find it anymore." The mafia boss walked around the desk and stood in front of her, not touching, just present. "Listen to me," the mafia boss said, his voice steady and absolutely certain. "You were silent because you had to be. That was survival, and survival is never weakness. But you're not in that chateau anymore. You're not that woman anymore. You've already escaped, already survived, already proven you're stronger than everything he threw at you." The mafia boss gestured toward the windows, toward London sprawling in the darkness. "You're not a victim anymore, Nadia. You're a survivor, and survivors fight back." His words hit her like lightning, illuminating something inside that had been dark for so long she'd forgotten it existed. She looked at the flash drive, then at the mafia boss, then at her own reflection in the darkened windows. A black woman in comfortable clothes, no makeup, natural hair, no bruises anymore, just fading scars that looked like evidence rather than shame. "Okay," she said, voice shaking but holding. "Okay, I'll testify, I'll tell my story. I'll fight back." The mafia boss nodded, something like pride flickering across his face. "Then we move forward, tomorrow morning." But tomorrow came faster than either of them expected, and it came with fire. Nadia woke to her phone buzzing, a new phone the mafia boss had given her, registered under a different name, untraceable to her old life. A message from an unknown number. "I know where you are, and I'm coming to bring you home." She sat bolt upright, fear flooding through her veins like ice water. She ran barefoot to the mafia boss's room at the other end of the penthouse and knocked hard. When the mafia boss opened the door, already dressed despite the early hour, like he'd never actually gone to sleep, she thrust the phone toward him. The mafia boss read the message, his expression darkening like storm clouds gathering. "He's bluffing," the mafia boss said calmly, though his jaw was tight. "He doesn't actually know where you are. He's trying to scare you into making a mistake, into running somewhere he can track you." "You don't know that." "I do know that," the mafia boss interrupted, "because if he actually knew where you were, he wouldn't send a warning. Men like him show up with lawyers and police and make a scene that forces compliance. Warnings mean he's fishing." But even as the mafia boss said it, his phone buzzed, then buzzed again, then started ringing with incoming calls that made his face go from calm to carefully controlled fury. The mafia boss answered one, listened, said 3 words in Czech that Nadia didn't understand, but that made her blood run cold anyway. Then he hung up and looked at her with an expression that was apologetic and dangerous in equal measure. "He made bail somehow," the mafia boss said quietly. "Someone pulled strings, diplomatic immunity claim through his mother's side of the family. Probably cost him a fortune in favors, but he's free while the investigation continues." Nadia felt the world tilt. "No, no, that's impossible. You said—" "I said I would handle this." The mafia boss cut her off, his voice turning to steel. And I will. But it means we accelerate the timeline. We move from dismantling to endgame, tonight. What does that mean? The mafia boss walked to his closet, pulled out a shoulder holster she hadn't known was there, checked a pistol with practiced efficiency, and holstered it beneath his jacket. When the mafia boss turned back to her, he was no longer the man who'd bought her art supplies or made her coffee. He was the mafia boss who dealt with problems that refused to solve themselves. It means I go have a conversation with your husband, the mafia boss said calmly, face to face, man to man, in a way that makes absolutely clear that you are not a possession to be retrieved. And if he's smart, he'll take the lifeline I'm offering and disappear quietly. And if he's not smart, then I stop being polite. Nadia grabbed the mafia boss's arm. You could be killed. He travels with armed security now. You saw them at the airport. The mafia boss looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face, and his expression softened just slightly. I've been doing this for 15 years, Nadia. I've survived wars and betrayals and men much more dangerous than your husband. I'll come back. The mafia boss paused. I promise you, I'll come back. Before she could argue further, the mafia boss was gone, the elevator doors closing like a curtain falling on an act she hadn't finished watching. Nadia spent the next 4 hours in agony, pacing the penthouse, staring at her phone, painting violent slashes of color on canvas just to have something to do with her hands. Victor had stayed behind, stationed by the door, silent and immovable as a mountain, his presence reassuring and terrifying in equal measure because it meant the mafia boss thought she might need protection while he was gone. When her phone finally buzzed with an incoming call from the mafia boss's number, she nearly dropped it in her rush to answer. I'm fine. His voice came through before she could speak, slightly rougher than usual, but steady. It's done. What's done? What happened? I'll tell you when I get back. 30 minutes. The line went dead. It was the longest 30 minutes of her life. When the mafia boss finally walked back into the penthouse, he looked tired, truly tired in a way she hadn't seen before, and there was blood on his knuckles that he tried to hide by keeping his hands in his pockets. Sit down, the mafia boss said before she could bombard him with questions. They sat across from each other in the living room. London glittering outside the windows like it hadn't just witnessed whatever had happened in the last few hours. I found him at a private club in Mayfair, the mafia boss began, his voice even despite the exhaustion. One of those old money establishments where people pay £50,000 a year for the privilege of drinking whiskey and pretending the modern world doesn't exist. He was with his lawyers, planning his next move, probably how to spin the narrative when you inevitably surface. Did you? Nadia couldn't finish the question. I didn't kill him, the mafia boss said flatly, though I wanted to. Wanted to very badly when he started talking about you like you were a car that had been stolen. Something he'd overpaid for and wanted returned in original condition. The mafia boss's hands tightened into fists, and Nadia saw the split knuckles more clearly now. I hit him, the mafia boss admitted, 3 times, once for every lie I'd confirmed he told police about you being unstable, once for the bruises Dr. Mehta documented, and once for the 8 months you spent counting euros in terror because he'd made you believe you had no other choice. Casper. Then I gave him an option, the mafia boss continued, talking over her concern. I showed him the flash drive with his financial crimes. I played him audio recordings of conversations he'd had with officials discussing bribes, recordings one of his own bodyguards sold me for double whatever Christophe was paying him. I showed him photographs of properties he'd illegally acquired, and I told him he had two choices. The mafia boss leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped in front of him. Choice one, I deliver all of this evidence to French authorities, British authorities, and several journalists who would love nothing more than to destroy a wealthy white man who's been getting away with crimes for years. He goes to prison. His family name becomes mud. Everything he inherited from his father's work gets seized or destroyed. And choice two? Nadia asked, though she was afraid of the answer. Choice two. He signs a legal document drafted by my lawyers that grants you an immediate, no-fault divorce, relinquishes all claims to marital property, agrees never to contact you or speak about you publicly, and quietly relocates to another country for a minimum of 5 years. In exchange, the evidence stays buried, though I keep copies as insurance against him changing his mind. Nadia sat very still. And? He chose option two. The mafia boss pulled out a folded document from his inside jacket pocket. Signed an hour ago in front of witnesses, notarized, legally binding. You're free. The words didn't register at first. Free. She turned the concept over in her mind like a word in a foreign language she was still learning. He agreed, she whispered, just like that? Not just like that, the mafia boss corrected. He raged, threatened, claimed I had no idea who I was dealing with, said he'd have me killed, you killed, everyone I'd ever cared about killed. The mafia boss's expression darkened. That's when I stopped being polite. What did you do? I had Victor bring in someone, a former associate of your husband's, who'd gone to prison for something Christophe had actually done, but pinned on him. A man who'd lost 5 years of his life because your husband needed a scapegoat and had the money to create one. Nadia's eyes widened. I offered this man the evidence to clear his name and sue for wrongful imprisonment, the mafia boss explained, right there in front of Christophe. Showed him exactly what would happen if he didn't sign, not just prison, but enemies, real enemies, people who don't issue warnings or negotiate. That's when he signed. Nadia looked at the document in the mafia boss's hand, at the signature that was legally Christophe's, but that had been coerced through fear and leverage and the kind of power that operated in shadows. Is this legal? She asked. Can he contest it? It's absolutely legal, the mafia boss assured her. Duress is difficult to prove when the document is signed voluntarily in front of neutral witnesses. And even if he tried to contest it, the evidence I have would come out during discovery, and his lawyers know it. They advised him to sign. The mafia boss handed her the document. Her hands shook as she took it, as she saw her name, her maiden name, which she'd almost forgotten how to claim as her own, and saw the word divorced stamped in official legal finality. It's really over? She asked, voice breaking. It's really over, the mafia boss confirmed. And then she did something she hadn't planned, something that came from a place deeper than thought. She launched herself across the space between them and wrapped her arms around the mafia boss, sobbing into his shoulder. 8 months of fear and pain and survival pouring out in great, heaving waves. The mafia boss stiffened for just a moment, surprised, And then his arms came around her carefully, like he was holding something precious that might break if he gripped too hard. "You're safe," the mafia boss murmured into her hair. "You're safe now. I promise." They stayed like that for a long time. Two people who'd been strangers on a plane, learning what it felt like to be something more. When Nadia finally pulled back, wiping her face with the sleeve of her borrowed shirt, she looked at the mafia boss with eyes that saw him clearly now, not as a savior or a threat, but as a man who carried his own scars and had chosen to make sure hers had value. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, for believing me, for fighting for me, for giving me back my life." The mafia boss smiled faintly, and for the first time since she'd met him, it reached his eyes. "You gave yourself your life back the moment you walked out of that chateau. I just made sure no one could take it away again." The next few weeks passed in a strange new rhythm that felt like life learning how to be gentle again. Nadia started therapy with a woman who specialized in trauma and domestic abuse, started eating regularly, sleeping through the night, laughing at things that were actually funny, instead of laughing because silence would have been dangerous. She launched a foundation funded quietly by the mafia boss but operating in her name that helped women escape abusive marriages, provided legal resources, safe housing, and job training. She spoke at conferences, stood before cameras with courage in her voice, and told her story not as a victim, but as proof that broken things could still shine, could still be whole, could still matter. And through it all, the mafia boss was there, not hovering, not controlling, not demanding anything in return, just there, a steady presence in the background of her healing, like bedrock beneath a house that was learning to stand on its own foundation again. One evening, after she'd given a speech at a charity gala, her first public appearance where she'd used both her maiden name and told her full story, bruises and all, she found the mafia boss waiting in the hallway outside the ballroom. The mafia boss was leaning against the wall in that black suit he'd worn on the plane, gold necklace catching the light, looking like he'd stepped out of a film about dangerous men with unexpected hearts. "You came," she said, surprise and pleasure mixing in her voice. "I told you I'd be here," the mafia boss replied simply. "You didn't have to sit through the whole thing. I know galas aren't your scene." "They're not," the mafia boss admitted, "but watching you reclaim your voice is worth suffering through rubber chicken and fundraising speeches." Nadia smiled, and it was the kind of smile that came from somewhere real, somewhere that didn't hurt anymore. "Walk with me?" she asked. They left the gala and walked through London in the late evening, side by side, but not touching, talking about everything and nothing. The mafia boss told her stories about growing up in Prague, about Katya and how she'd loved painting too, how she'd wanted to be an artist before life and violence had taken that dream away. She told the mafia boss about foster care, about being the only black girl in some of the homes she'd lived in, about learning to make herself small and quiet and useful so maybe people would want to keep her, about how Christophe had felt like finally being chosen until she'd realized being chosen by the wrong person was worse than being alone. "What happens next?" the mafia boss asked eventually, as they stood on a bridge over the Thames, watching the river reflect the city's lights in rippling gold. "For you or for me?" Nadia asked. "Both?" She considered the question carefully. "For me, I keep building the foundation, keep telling my story. Maybe I go back to school, finish that art history degree I abandoned. Maybe I travel. Maybe I just exist without fear for a while and see what that feels like. And for us, the question was quiet, vulnerable in a way she'd never heard from the Mafia boss. She turned to look at him fully. What do you want there to be for us? The Mafia boss was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching hers in the dim light. I want to know if this thing between us is real, the Mafia boss said finally, or if it's just trauma and gratitude and proximity creating an illusion. I want to know if you can see me as something other than the man who saved you, because that's not a foundation for anything real. And I want to know, the Mafia boss continued, his voice rough with honesty, if you'll still want me around when you're healed and whole and don't need protection anymore. When I'm just a man who does questionable things for complicated reasons without the polish of being your rescuer. Nadia reached out and took the Mafia boss's hand, interlacing their fingers. Casper, she said gently, you're not a rescuer. You're a man who saw someone in pain and chose to care. That's different. That's better. And I don't want you because you saved me. I want you because you saw me at my lowest and treated me like I was still human, because you gave me choices when everyone else in my life had taken them away, because you understand scars without needing them explained. She squeezed the Mafia boss's hand. I don't know if this is real in the forever sense, she admitted. I don't know if I'm capable of that kind of certainty yet, but I know it's real right now, and I know I want to find out what it becomes. The Mafia boss smiled then, a real smile, the kind that cracked through all his careful control. Then stay, the Mafia boss said simply. Not in my penthouse as my protection project. Stay in London, build your foundation, build your life, and let me be part of it, not as your savior or your bodyguard, but as someone who wants to watch you paint and hear your voice when you laugh, and maybe, eventually, earn the right to love you properly. Nadia felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were the good kind this time. Okay, she whispered. Okay. The Mafia boss cupped her face gently with both hands, and for a moment they just stood there on a bridge in London with the river flowing beneath them, and the city breathing around them, and the future stretching out uncertain, but possible. For what it's worth, the Mafia boss said quietly, I think you're the bravest person I've ever met, and I've met a lot of dangerous people. Nadia laughed despite the tears. Is that supposed to be a compliment? It's the highest one I know how to give. And then the Mafia boss kissed her, soft and careful, like she was something precious he was afraid to break. And she kissed him back, standing on her toes, her hands gripping his jacket, letting herself be vulnerable in a way that felt like strength instead of weakness. When they finally pulled apart, London had gotten darker and later, but neither of them noticed. Come on, the Mafia boss said, taking her hand. Let's go home. And for the first time in 8 months, maybe in her whole life, Nadia knew exactly what home meant. It wasn't a place. It wasn't safety or walls or locked doors. It was standing next to someone who saw your scars and didn't turn away, who fought for you without taking over your fight, who gave you space to heal and stayed close enough to catch you if you stumbled. Home was the man who'd sat beside her on a plane and offered his shoulder without demanding anything in return. 6 months later, Nadia stood in a gallery in Shoreditch, surrounded by her paintings, bold, colorful, angry, joyful, honest works that told the story of breaking and becoming without apologizing for either. The opening had drawn a crowd larger than she'd expected, and she watched as strangers examined her work with expressions that ranged from thoughtful to moved to uncomfortable in the best possible way. The Mafia boss stood in the back of the gallery, dressed in that same black suit, gold necklace, watching her with an expression that made her chest feel warm. A journalist approached her, one of the reputable ones, not the tabloid vultures who'd tried to turn her story into clickbait. "Your work is incredibly powerful," the journalist said, gesturing to a painting that showed a woman with a yellow jacket and blood-stained white shirt, standing in an airport terminal with wings growing from her shoulders. "Is this autobiographical?" Nadia smiled. "Everything is autobiographical if you look close enough, but yes, that's the moment I remembered I could fly." "And what would you say to other women in situations like the one you escaped?" Nadia looked at the painting, then at the Mafia boss across the room, then back at the journalist. "I'd say that leaving is the hardest thing you'll ever do, that asking for help doesn't make you weak, that the world will try to tell you that you're crazy or dramatic or asking for it, but the truth is simpler than all of that. You deserve to be safe, and anyone who makes you unsafe doesn't deserve access to you." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "And I'd say that sometimes help comes from unexpected places. Sometimes the person you meet on a Tuesday saves your life on a Thursday. Sometimes the scariest looking door is the one that leads to freedom. And sometimes the people who society calls dangerous are the only ones brave enough to stand between you and the things that are actually dangerous." The journalist scribbled notes, then looked up. "And the man in the back? The one who keeps looking at you like you're the only art in the room?" Nadia grinned. "That's Casper. He's complicated. Boyfriend? Something like that. Something better than that. Something that doesn't have a word yet." After the journalist moved on, the Mafia boss crossed the gallery to her side. "You're incredible," the Mafia boss said simply. "Says the Mafia boss to the artist," she teased. "Says the man to the woman he loves," the Mafia boss corrected, his tone serious despite the smile in his eyes. Nadia's breath caught. It was the first time either of them had said the word out loud, though it had been hovering between them for months, like smoke that finally decided to become fire. "I love you too," she said, and saying it felt like flying. They stood together in that gallery, surrounded by paintings of breaking and becoming, and Nadia thought about the woman she'd been 8 months ago, terrified, trapped, counting euros in the lining of her grandmother's handbag. She thought about yellow suit jackets and bloodstains that wouldn't quite wash out, about turbulence on planes and shoulders offered without demand, about bruises that faded and scars that didn't, and learning the difference between the two. She thought about men who hurt and men who healed, and how the world got it backwards sometimes, calling one type dangerous and the other type safe when really it was the opposite. And she thought about how the best stories don't end with happily ever after because life doesn't work that way. The best stories end with becoming whole, becoming free, becoming the person you were always meant to be before someone tried to make you smaller. That night, after the gallery closed and they walked back through London in comfortable silence, the Mafia boss asked the question she'd been expecting. Do you ever regret it? Getting on that plane? Taking my card? Trusting a stranger? Nadia stopped walking and turned to face the Mafia boss under a street lamp that painted them both in amber light. No, she said firmly, because that plane took me away from a life that was killing me and toward a life that's mine. And you, she reached up to touch the Mafia boss's face gently. You gave me back something I'd forgotten I was allowed to have. What's that? Choices. The Mafia boss pulled her close, and they stood there on a London street corner. A black woman who'd learned to fly, and a Mafia boss who'd learned that the most powerful thing you can do with violence is refuse to use it. The story could have ended there, neat and tidy, with lessons learned and wounds healed. But life doesn't work that way. There would be hard days ahead, days when Nadia woke up afraid for no reason her conscious mind could name, when her body remembered terror her mind had started to forget. Days when the Mafia boss's past knocked on the door in the form of enemies or consequences or violence that didn't care about his good intentions. Days when they fought about boundaries and independence and what love looks like when both people have been broken in different ways. But there would also be good days. Days when Nadia painted until her hands were stained with color and the Mafia boss sat reading nearby, comfortable in silence. Days when they cooked dinner together badly and laughed at the results. Days when his phone rang with problems and she squeezed his hand in support before he answered. Days when her nightmares woke them both and the Mafia boss held her without asking for explanation. Days that added up to a life that was messy and real and theirs. And isn't that what survival becomes, eventually? Not the absence of scars, but the presence of days where scars don't define you. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of people who make you brave enough to try anyway. Not the fairy tale ending where everything is perfect. Just the honest ending where everything is possible. The camera would pan out now if this were a film, pulling back from the Mafia boss and Nadia on that street corner, rising above London's lights, showing the vast city where millions of stories were unfolding simultaneously. Some tragic, some triumphant, most somewhere in between. But this isn't a film. This is the story of a woman who wore a yellow suit jacket stained with blood on a plane from Paris to London, and the Mafia boss who sat beside her and decided her safety mattered more than minding his own business. This is the story of how sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is trust that not everyone who has power will use it to hurt you. This is the story of breaking and becoming and the thin line between the two. And it's a story that doesn't end here because the best stories never really end. They just pause. Take a breath and continue. So here's the question for you, watching from wherever you are, living whatever story you're in the middle of. Would you have trusted the man sitting beside you on that plane? Would you have taken the card, gotten in the car? Let a stranger fight battles you'd been losing alone? Or would fear have kept you running in circles, trusting the devil you knew over the mystery you didn't? There's no right answer. Only the answer that keeps you alive and lets you learn to fly again. Drop your thoughts in the comments below and tell us what you would have done. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button because the next story we're bringing you will reach even deeper into the places where courage and desperation meet, where ordinary people do extraordinary things just to survive another day, where the line between hero and villain depends entirely on whose story you're hearing.